So I think we can get started. We heard Professor Sinn before. We have heard there is quite a bit of uncertainty, but the key question is, will uncertainty also lead to undiscovered opportunities? And if so, how do we find them? Those are some of the questions we want to tackle over the next 60 minutes or so. I am pleased to introduce our panel of experts to you. To my far right, you had the pleasure of hearing him just before the break, unless you came late and just sneaked in. Professor Hans-Werner Sinn, president of the IFO Institute in Munich. Right next to him, Professor Urs Birchler, professor for banking at the Institute for Swiss Banking Industry at the University of Zurich. For many years, he was also director of financial stability at the Swiss National Bank, and he also wrote a book together with his wife, Information Economics. Welcome. To my left, Remy Briand, managing director and global head of index and ESG research at MSCI. As most of you know, MSCI is a leading provider of investment decision support tools, including indices, portfolio risks, and performance analytics, as well as governance tools. Welcome. And to my far left, Nassim Taleb, distinguished professor of risk engineering at the Polytechnic Institute of New York University. Now, with 3 million copies sold, chances are many of you will have read his bestseller, The Black Swan. In his new book, Anti-Fragile, he writes that he never makes appointments because he hates having a date in the calendar. It makes him feel like a prisoner. So please feel very honored that he agreed to this date and that he actually kept the appointment. You should feel welcome. You should feel even more honored once you hear what he thinks about bankers. He has, quote, a physical allergy to them. And just so you know, Professor Sinn and Professor Birchler, he considers a Nobel Prize for economics a fraud. But don't you worry, I'm not better off than all of you guys. Mr. Taleb writes, the business of journalism is about pure entertainment, not the search for truth. So by now you probably realize why I chose to have another panelist seated in between Mr. Taleb and me. Nevertheless, a warm welcome to you, Nassim Taleb. We are, and no irony there, truly pleased to have you here, that you made it all the way from New York. Thank you very much. Now, apart from Professor Sinn, all other participants of this panel will also give detailed presentations later, but we feel that this panel, at this time so early after the first presentation, will help lay the groundwork and frame the rest of the day's discussions for us. Of course, we might touch certain aspects that will be addressed later too, but as we all know, repetition is the mother of all learning. So for the next 60 minutes, we would like you to be asking the bulk of the questions. This is because A, this event, of course, has been created for you, and we want you to get the most out of it. B, it's our hope that you come away from this event with ideas and solutions to apply to your professional life. And of course, C, let's remember that journalists are here for entertainment only, so I shouldn't be doing all the talking. Don't be shy, just raise your hands if you want to say something, if you want to speak, or if you want to ask a question, and we will then hand you one of our microphones. I'll just start off, get things going, and then let you guys take over. Now, of course, economists, Professor Birchler, very often tend to have very different views on the same issues. Right now, they also have completely different ideas about how the euro can be saved, what went wrong, what could potentially go wrong. Therefore, let me ask you, do you agree or do you disagree with the views Professor Sinn outlined just before the break?
Well, thank you very much. Let me, say hello to the distinguished audience, and let me briefly comment on the diversity of opinions among economists. That is, of course, a well-established fact. I gave an interview with my wife, who happens to be an economics professor as well, and she mentioned that I had forecasted, I had actually frightened our son about inflation. And he came and said, Mama, Daddy says inflation is coming. He was totally panicked.
He just wanted more pocket money, probably.
No, he wasn't even thinking of that's an interesting point. He was just kind of frightened about some coordination system floating away. He was not thinking about what it meant to him. He's not that far yet. He's 11 years old.
All right.
But he was frightened about losing the coordination system. So he went to my wife and said, Daddy says inflation is coming. And then I said, but I said, not now, it may take 2-3 years. And then my wife said, well, calm down. He said that 3 years ago already. And of course, the journalist laughed at. And we got letters saying, well, obviously economics is not worth anything if they do disagree that way. I happen to agree very much, though, with Professor Sinn. And I think that was a very enlightening, perfectly transparent exposition of the problems, the financial problems in the European Union. I would even think he made it even a bit better than it is. I think that there is a big, and I said that before, there is a tragedy about the European Monetary Union, and tragedy in the very term of the Greek tragedy, that you want to avoid your fate, and you find your fate by trying to avoid it. And I mean, the European idea is great. Never again a war in Europe. Let's get together, let's work together. And then you overdo it because you want to really kind of put things together in a way you can never divorce again. You introduce the common currency with the result that at the end the Greeks are on around with Nazi flags and Mrs. Merkel on the transparency. I mean, that's the tragical thing. And today, unfortunately, there is a monopoly on being a good European if you are in favor of more union, more banking union, political union, etc. And you are a bad European if, like Professor Sinn, you say, I beg to differ, maybe there is a problem here.
Right, so, but that also means that you agree with them that fragile countries should leave the Eurozone, at least temporarily?
Well, I think they should never have been invited, but that's not the issue here. And yeah, I think a lot of opportunities have been missed by politicians who said if Greece falls, the euro falls. If the euro fails, Europe fails. That's how you cut off your most important opportunities to solve the problems. Sooner or later, the Greece will probably have to leave the EU, and there are very discreet ways of sneaking out. Let's say at one point in time they don't get more German money. They still have to pay their employees. So what they do, they issue something like IOUs, like California, which are denominated in euro, but of course are not euros. They are just coupons, which you may later use to pay Greek taxes. So they eat their future tax cake. I'm not saying that's the only scenario, but that would be one way to sneak out of the euro temporarily, and perhaps the IOUs would be redeemed with real euros or won't. We could leave that open.
Mr. Taleb, you compare economic research to medieval medicine. Economists, in your view, are, you said once, weak, ignorant, fearful, and generally pathetic. Apparently, you once even fantasized about beating up an economist in public. Now, let's hope that won't happen today.
She's reading secondhand. That's the problem with journalism, is that she's repeating something secondhand read from another journalist who's repeating something dangerous. Another journalist said. Yeah, because I see the quotes cluster around, correlate around The Guardian. And because of my association with David Cameron, The Guardian writes one negative review every 12 days of my work. And they, of course, correlated. And they make sure that most of the people who write them haven't read the book, because if you read the book, you may be tempted to, say something nice. So anyway,
well, but let's just say you are very critical of economists.
Let me explain now. Effectively, technically, I'm an economist because I just accepted a position at the Centre d'économie de la Sorbonne, right, as a visiting. So I'm going to be an economist for about 2 years, I think, unless they kick me out before. So technically, I'm an economist. I'm in a risk business. So let me explain exactly what the problem I had with economics. I was once in Korea in 2009, and I went. It was a panel like this, but before the panel, every person had to present a little lecture, right? Make a little speech with PowerPoints. You can recognize, of course, economists because they have PowerPoints. And there was a gentleman who's number 2 of the IMF, Mr. Kato or something like that. He went up and gave the projections of the IMF for 2009, 10, 11, 12, whatever, all this. It was very nice. And then he spoke. When it was my turn to go up, I said, okay, we'd like to invite Mr. Kato back to the stage. Give us the predictions for 2009, 2008, and 2007, made in 2000, 2001, 2002, etc. All right? So people understand that your predictions are unreliable, which is not a problem, except that the conclusion is that for technical reasons, economic variables depend on tail events. And tail events are fundamentally, technically, mathematically unpredictable. You need billions of years of data, assuming stationarity, to figure out small probabilities in fat-tailed domains. So the idea is very simple. The solution is either to Mr. Kato, the IMF, to get better, which they won't. Actually, I'm employed now by the IMF, incidentally, all right? I'm an advisor to the IMF, where I was doing something I'll present this afternoon to detect tail risk in bank balance sheets. Anyway, so the solution is either for them to get better, or let's build systems that can work very well with under unpredictability. No? The second solution is much easier. And we're now in Switzerland, in the Zurich canton, and Switzerland works beautifully because it doesn't have to rely on economic predictions. You see? That's it. Design a robust system that can work with the inability by the economic establishment to forecast economic variables with a tolerable error rate. That's the whole point. And what is the design system? Of course, you have to have low debt and decentralization and some other attributes. But with 2 or 3 heuristics, number one, low government debt, or at least if you're going to have debt, don't have it at the top, have it at the bottom, as low as you can. In other words, have it at a municipal level, which creates noise, but we can handle that rather than have it at the top. And of course, have overall low level of debt. And the second one, be as decentralized as you can, which is exactly the opposite of what the Brussels ideology has been for the past 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are critical of conglomerates of size in general. So is a currency union necessarily more fragile than a single nation state?
Okay, I was a currency, before I became, whatever I'm doing now, I was a trader for 20-some years. And when you're a trader, an option trader, and this is why I will feel understood here later when I talk about everything as long or short volatility. But I was traded for a very long time. And I remember that nobody really, when they had the drachma, I remember Mark Lira, when the Italians had their currency, I remember all these things. And at the time, people had their own currency. They didn't really have their own currency because they wouldn't borrow, and nobody would lend them in drachma except at exorbitant rates. And people would at the time, I remember that people would talk Deutschmark. That was the currency of Europe. So what you've done with the euro is institutionalize the Deutschmark fully. And instead of volatility at the level of the currency, you have volatility now at the level of interest rates. See, they all borrow in the same currency, but they have different rates. So that's what it seems. So it's not like the fact that having a euro or not having a euro isn't as big a deal as other things that they've tried to do in Europe, to mess things up.
Well,
sure
you wanted to jump in?
No.
Okay, all right. No. I saw he seemed happy with my remark. But it was the dominance of the Deutschmark. We spoke Deutschmark. Yeah. You see, and in fact, you spoke lira by translating from Deutschmark. So there is a slight difference, but it's not as big as it's in the mind. Having a unique currency, is a single currency, is very good if you travel a lot and don't want to pay a lot of commissions. That's the main purpose. But look at here. We live in Switzerland. We're in Switzerland. You can use Deutschmark. You can Deutschmark, sorry, euro. I'm forecasting, all right. You can,
something you say you never do.
The fact that they have their own currency has not prevented them from integrating economically with, with the European community.
Well, I think we might hear about some problems that Switzerland has a little later from Professor Birchler. Professor Sinn, maybe we come back to something we touched just now and that you spoke about earlier, the key question if fragile countries should leave the Eurozone. Of course, there is the key concern that this would cause enormous turmoil if individual countries or even just one country withdraws from the monetary union. Don't you think that would be a considerable risk?
Oh yeah,
and that speculators, of course,
everything is risky. We have to compare the different risks. I personally think that the risk of moving Europe towards debt mutualization is much, much bigger than any financial turmoil could be. I see the difficulty with what we are doing is that we are changing credit contracts, private credit contracts into public credit contracts. That's what we are doing in this crisis. Between the debtor and the creditor, there's not a nice relationship. There's always a tension. But we have the civil law to subdue this tension and to resolve it somehow. The society has found its way. If we now lift this debtor-creditor relationship from the private level to the level between states, then we make the strife between these two parties a public affair and lift it to the public discourse. And that is bound to lead to strife between the countries of Europe and is very dangerous for Europe's future. And that sort of danger that comes out of that is uncomparable to any financial crisis. So I really don't understand that people point to a financial crisis and put it on the same level as these fundamental political conflicts that come when you make countries, bring countries into debtor-creditor relationships. And this is why I pointed to the United States of America. You know, Harold James pointed out that, as I cited at the end, that the debt mutualization was not a cement, as Hamilton thought. It was an explosive. And then he draws the line from the crisis, these state bankruptcies in 38, 42, from there to 1861, when the War of Secession began. You know, it is dangerous in the extreme way. Apart from that, I think the claim that there would be a major crisis is a little bit overdone. I heard this claim a year ago, before we had the haircut for Greece. Actually, it was the biggest bankruptcy of a state in history thus far. If you take the volume of the haircut, it's not called a bankruptcy, but the insurance agencies treated it as a bankruptcy and paid out the money. So it was a bankruptcy. And despite all the claims that the world would go under because of this haircut, nothing happened whatsoever, because everyone had anticipated it. And so it will be when Greece exits.
Well, there's always a question, is it, what of it is science and how much of it is faith, Mr. Briand? If it was all science, of course, we could clearly stipulate a path toward achieving economic growth, but as evidenced by the variation of economic performance of developing countries, that doesn't seem to be possible, right?
Yes, never make prediction, especially about the future. That's sort of the the whole saying. Yes, but what I think is striking is we've been through the discussion this morning focusing a lot on the euro crisis. But if you look a bit more broadly, and it might be just called comfort, but the other countries, especially developed countries, are a little bit in the same state. So if you look at the US, there is this similar mechanism of being financed by the Chinese, as well. You look at Japan, the levels of debts are very high. So there is generally a level of debt worldwide, or especially in the developed country, which is very high. So there will be some mechanisms of adjustments, and obviously there is the question whether inflation is a smooth way or to get out of the problem. So again, predictions are hard, but there is, in our minds a constant though, which is it's about diversification. And it's about making sure that when we get to investments, there is a not putting all the eggs in the basket, especially a home basket. May make sense.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Taleb, you say that top-down efforts to eliminate volatility, whether in the form of neurotically overprotective parents or central banks like the Federal Reserve, Chairman Alan Greenspan at the time trying to smooth out economic fluctuations by injecting cheap money into the systems, end up making things more fragile, not less. Mr. Sinn also said he's very critical about the way monetary policy is conducted. So should we just allow a little bit more chaos to happen in economies?
Interestingly, the chairman of, the Bank of England, the head of the Bank of England, was making these remarks. He gave a lecture on how we should have more volatility in the system. But that's not this. But that's at the core. That's not the problem. The problem we had in the United States is that it's so centralized that one person named, actually we made two mistakes last decade. One, Mr. Bush, the second, Mr. Greenspan. And then economic life, one single person. I mean, there were definitely, Mr. Bush cost us somewhere between 50 and 200 times original estimates. And we're paying the price. A lot of our deficits come from that. And the second, Mr. Greenspan. How could one person be allowed to misread the system and cause such devastating problems? I mean, he tried to smooth out the economic cycle. He said no more boom and bust. Actually, you give him nature, he would say no more seasons, right? Be spring all the time. So no more boom and bust. So what happened is it had accumulation of hidden risk and very low interest rates after September 11. The accumulation of hidden risks. You had people willing to sell their mother for 2 basis points over LIBOR, all right? So like accumulation of hidden risk under the system, under the radar. And of course, we had Mr. Bernanke, who thought it was a great moderation. No volatility, when meanwhile, it's like sitting on dynamite. And of course, it exploded. So the point isn't so much of what's the right policy. The point is never to have, ever, one man or one person make a very large mistake in the system. And to do that, you need some safeguards. Decentralization, of course, is one solution. Preventing the government, because now who's paying for it? Okay, we're paying indirectly for it, those who did the right thing, because you had a rise of unlike what you have in Europe, we had a huge rise of private debt. And now we're in a mechanism of transforming private debt into public debt in the United States, which is why the United States has twice the deficit. We'll have for 2013 twice the deficit of the Eurozone, we're hoping. All right, it's not going to get worse. So you have that transfer. So this is why the United States, we're not in great shape. Europe, at least, is conscious of the problem. They're going through chemotherapy, so they look sick. Where the United States, they haven't started yet. And we keep accumulating these deficits. And we're not doing anything about it. And we don't have the system. And nobody thought, hey, you know what? We need a system that won't allow a third mistake, like that, that would cost us so many trillions. We don't have that. We don't have that. No consciousness of it. They're bickering over nothing. So this is why I'm more positive on Europe. I bought euros for my own account. I have this thing in my new book where I say I can't forecast because I'm never harmed. I can harm you with a forecast because people take more risk when they hear a forecast. But out of ethics, I can tell you what I'm doing. You see, that way I'm harmed first. So I told you what I did in my portfolio, okay? I bought Europe. I bought the currency because I'm more comfortable spreading my risk because I think at least the Europeans, they know about the problem. They talk about it too much. They scare us too much. They argue too much, okay? They make too many headlines in the Financial Times, but at least they're dealing with it, okay? In the United States, we don't have that. So I bought euro against dollar.
All right. Okay. So you're not upbeat for the Eurozone.
Or, of course, not Swiss franc. I can't afford it. Nobody can afford Swiss franc anymore.
Very
I saw the
interesting.
prices last night at the restaurant.
Well, Professor Sinn, you actually did sound as if you were more critical of the European Central Bank than the Federal Reserve. Are you also generally more upbeat on the economic prospects for the US rather than the Eurozone? Would you agree with Mr. Taleb?
No, the US does have its problems. The American debt GDP ratio is at a level where Greece was 5 years ago or 6 years ago. So I don't know where that will lead. The deficit has been very large, and America has, I think, to increase its taxes and maybe also think about its military expenditure, which absorbs a lot of resources. Apart from that, the special criticism which I had here against the ECB would not apply to the American system. America is not America. There are so many different aspects of that state, and I think their monetary system, which developed in an evolutionary way over the last 200 years, by now has reached a state which is more stable than what we have. We try to reinvent the wheel here in Europe with giving this free access to the local printing press and making this printing press also keeping this printing press under government control. I mean, that is the worst thing, what we have done. The direct control over the national central bank. It's a national central bank. It's not a private institution. The district feds in America are private, after all. They are not public institutions, and the districts don't fall together with states, but they overlap quite a number of states. So in the first place, in America, a local state has no access to the printing press if it has financial problems. Here in Europe, if you have a problem in Greece, if this Greek state has a problem, it prints some government bonds and sells these government bonds to the private banks, and the private banks give it to the Greek central bank as collateral, and the Greek central bank prints the money, in an unlimited way. So there has been government finance with the printing press in Europe throughout the period. And something like that is not happening in the United States, despite all difficulties which the United States has elsewhere.
So would you also invest your money rather in the euro than in the US dollar?
Oh, I have no money, so it's not a problem.
Okay, if a relative of yours asked you, a relative who had money, would ask you for an advice, would you say buy euros or buy dollars?
No, I think when you are in Germany, stay in Germany. Germany is, in the moment, the safe haven. If the euro breaks up, the Deutschmark will revalue. So I endorse this. Yeah? You can invest in Germany, fine. You can invest in Switzerland, no problem.
Professor Birchler, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, there was just one remark I wanted to make about the US or about the dollar or about US government debt. I think it is typical for the type of risks we are facing these days, and I hope Mr. Taleb would correct me. He knows more about risk than I do. But, uncertainty or risk was always around. I mean, the world is uncertain. But we have this particular risk that comes up with the rising debt levels, which is, let's call it self-fulfilling prophecies. I'll have that on the slides. But when the rating agencies downgraded US government bonds a little bit, then the price of the bonds went up because investors said, well, the world is becoming more uncertain, we have to go into US government paper, which at the face of it is a somewhat perverse reaction. I do not know any other asset that is downgraded and the demand rises. So it has become very, very hard to forecast what happens, if this is chaos or fractal things or fragility, I don't know, but it's ghastly. And I would like to thank Mr. Taleb, by the way, that you compared economics to medieval medicine. You could have chosen witchcraft.
Did you say that?
Yeah.
Or was it just the journalist?
I compared some branches of economics to medieval medicine.
You see, he did.
No,
I didn't make it up.
Actually, no, I did. Another thing, skin in the game. I was at some point undergrad had some training as an econometrician, and so therefore I compared econometrics to medieval medicine. So that was my statement, because they visibly whatever they do is pretty much like random, but they spin the story and they put more math just to hide that they don't know where they're going.
Is it not frustrating at times as an economist? I mean, how much of what you do is science and how much of it is a matter of faith?
You mean me?
Well, economists in general, but you happen to be an economist, married to an economist, so you're all into economics.
The frustration is always a question of what your anticipations are. I think economists are very good in structuring things. I mean, what we saw from Professor Sinn this morning, if that is not good in economics, then I do not know what. And economists have been would have been very useful. Economists did actually warn of the dangers of the European Union. Economists do actually show quite convincingly that, for instance, the US war on drugs was lost from the first day, and one should stop it rather sooner than later. Economists are very, very useful, and sometimes it would pay to listen to them.
Can I also say something on that?
Of course.
I realized this public debate about the quality of economics, which was launched by journalists in Germany who are not economists and don't understand a thing. And they took the forecasts which are made and compared the forecasts with what happened, and the short-term forecast did not anticipate the collapse at the time of Lehman. You know, that's how the debate began. But I must say, forecasting is not part of our subject, which we teach at the university. It is something which institutes, I must admit, as my institute also do, because there is a demand by the public. But we have always a very bad feeling about it, because we cannot at all satisfy the precision requirements which the public has. We make a forecast about not the level of GDP, but about the growth rate. And then people look at deviations in the growth rate, even though we give the confidence interval always, which is huge. It is never reported in the press. They always take the point estimate about the change, the time derivative of this GDP value, and compare that with the numbers coming from the statistical office, which also are forecasts and subject to mistakes and are revised many times over in the years to come. What can I say? This is not what we are doing. Economists are completely different in their orientation. I would compare it with medicine. A doctor cannot predict when the cancer starts or another disease. He's not good at that. And if you force him, he might do it, but it's always wrong. Still, medicine is able, once the disease has occurred, to talk about possible cures and analyze what has happened. Or take geologists and earthquakes. It's difficult to predict an earthquake. The science is not yet that far. But once it has happened, they can analyze it and explain what happened. So that is similar to that. Would you rather give up the science because we can't predict? I think the demand is simply too high.
I agree with you on a few points. The first one, that effectively an academic economist is not in a business of going in front of a TV and giving forecasts. And effectively, it's an entire different business. It's the business of forecasting economists is different from those of academic economists. And you have, of course, different branches of economics. So, which are the ones that have a bad track record? Unfortunately, is the ones that use certain class of mathematics certain models that depend on certain class of assumptions, mostly in finance. Like if you're in finance, if you follow Mr. Markowitz, it sets us back to what was used before, to Kelly criterion, for example. Mr. Markowitz, optimization. So literally, there's branches that are completely rotten that if you don't use them, you're a lot better off than if you use them. If you apply the heuristics of Professor Gigrenzer, for example, you're vastly more advanced than if you use optimization techniques in some domains. So this is a little technical, but there are areas of economics that are definitely in the wrong, and the comparison with medicine is adequate in the following sense. There was a time when it was going to the doctor, it was something called iatrogenics, is harm done by the healer, which is very measurable, statistically very measurable. Going to the doctor increases your chances of death, okay? Or there are situations. Why? Because effectively, you had to figure out that until penicillin, we had a rise of medicine that was more harmful to the patients, like over-interventionism, like removing tonsils systematically, back surgeries and stuff like that. So there's a class of things where it's better not to go to the doctor, except when you're very, very ill for a certain class of thing. And modern medicine didn't come out of the regular branches of medicine. It came out of the barbers, the street surgeons and stuff like that, that were more clinical and less theoretical. So saying that the economic sciences that we have today can evolve into something usable is a little off, because medicine didn't evolve. The Aristotelian, Galenian, Avicenna medicine was actually destroyed here in Switzerland, you see, by practical medicine. There are complete two branches: medicine for theories, it was a theology, part of theology, and medicine that gave birth to clinical medicine in the 19th century, early 20th century. And now, of course, if we're alive today, it's because it came from the branch of clinical medicine. And it came from a lot of people, but it was here, including here, when you had Paracelsus, for example, who, of course, was not, the most scientifically developed human, but he destroyed medicine and started the process of using practical solutions in place of theories.
Mm. You want to say something on that?
Yeah, I just wonder whether the comparison between medicine and economics was really fair here, because in medicine, the same profession is responsible for both the diagnosis and the therapy. In economics, the economists are responsible for the diagnosis, but the politicians do the therapy.
That's perfectly right. There's someone who wrote, actually, the solution, the Ariel Rubinstein, I'm writing here, banned economists from getting involved in practical problems. He said, you are there to develop models, and you should let the practitioners come hang themselves if they make a mistake. Yeah. Keep doing what you're doing. You're not responsible, okay? Stay at the theoretical level, and then they can come and look at the menu of the things you've developed, and they take what they want. Let the practitioners develop, because economics that we're talking about now is not the economics of the university. It's the hospital surgery, you see? And then you don't let a theoretician, fly a plane or do hospital surgery or operate on your brain, you see? So this is why we have had, unfortunately, in the United States, we have had too many professional economists like Mr. Bernanke come in and start flying a plane instead of hiring someone from Wall Street who knows those planes crash. You see? That's the problem, is that you should have at the helm someone who comes from the markets and trading rather than someone who comes from a university.
Time's running, so are there any questions by now from the audience? Don't be shy. I know some people approached Mr. Sinn, Professor Sinn, in the break right after his presentation. You should have shared it with us. Anyone who wants to ask a question? Yeah, there in the second or third row in the back.
Thank you very much. Question to Professor Sinn. How do you see the chance or the risk that France sooner or later has to join the club of the GIP, SIC countries?
It's already in the club. the rescue operations rescue the French banking sector. That's for sure. And this is why France is so much interested in these debt mutualization schemes, the ESM and the ECB policy and so on. As I said, the thing is, we have only a few countries that have capital exports in the Eurozone. Germany is the biggest, the Netherlands, Finland, and so on. The capital export flows everywhere, but to a large extent to France, into France, and out of France. And the French banking sector has developed its speciality in investing the money in the banking sectors of Southern Europe. In Greece in particular, the exposure is enormous. And the crisis of Southern Europe is a crisis of the French banking sector. And rather than solving this crisis, this problem itself, France prefers community solutions. Now, the French situation is even worse if you look to the real economy. And here come two things together. It's so much exposed to Southern Europe, the banking financial system, and then the real economy has really lost ground with, as I said, manufacturing share in GDP, which is lower than the British, less than half of the German one, and a government share in GDP, which is the second highest of all OECD countries. There's no country closer to socialism than France in the Eurozone. You know, the number of government employees relative to the total workforce is twice of what Germany has. So they have absorbed their problems by expanding the government sector. There were not enough jobs in the private sector, so they made them public employees, you know. For some while that worked, but now France has come to a point when they have to change. This simply doesn't work anymore. And The Economist had this title story about it a few weeks ago. Some thought it was overdrawn. I think it was appropriate.
There is a question here in the fifth row.
This is an open question for the panel. I'm wondering what you believe the most appropriate mandate for a central bank is. Should it be that of the ECB, which is simply to ensure price stability? Should it be a dual mandate like the Fed, price stability and growth, or should it be something else entirely?
Oh, very interesting. You want to respond to that?
Again, the problem is we should look at what the most stable environment would be, and that's one in which government debt is very small. When government debt is small, mistakes made by central banks matter much less. So the solution isn't a level of whether you give them a mandate, because effectively, even if like the ECB, you give them one mandate, they're going to have political pressure to do something else. You see, so the point is not the mandate. The point is, if you don't have, like now, quantitative easing is the big problem we have in the United States. And they hope maybe to inflate a little bit, but the problem is with inflation, as we well know, is very nonlinear. You inflate, nothing happens. Nothing happens, and then something blows up in your face, and it's too late to realize. So this conversation about quantitative easing wouldn't have existed if the government of the U.S., the federal government, did not take the losses of the private sector and converted them. So that wouldn't have happened. So all these conversations about the role of central banks are really conversations about deficit and size of government and fiscal irresponsibility.
Yeah. Well, as a former central banker, I should automatically say price stability is, of course, the right mandate, because the central bank has one instrument and needs one goal. But of course, the question is irrelevant if you have a state sector that runs into huge deficit, which again, of course, one feeds on each other. So it's in fact, it's a very tricky question. But I would say first, sound government finances, and then the simple mandate makes sense.
Yeah. I would also, if I may, fully agree. If you're sitting on the printing press, you're inclined to solve all the problems of the world with loosening the budget constraints. And that is the greatest sin you can do in an economy with scarce resources. So the inflation goal, in a sense, is aiming at limiting this mistake.
There was another question here in the third row.
This is a question for Mr. Taleb. If I heard you right, you argued that to individuals, George W. and Greenspan were the mistakes, the problems, the culprits, and thus arguing that stability, robustness is being compromised if you give that type of enormous power to one individual. Now my question is, how else do you think that the governance of man over man should or could have, if not at the end, one individual?
Okay, we're in this country, and in the book I write, this is a wonderful country. The best possible political system is one that works very well, and in which not a single most people casually don't know the name of the president. I mean, we can quiz the Swiss fellow here. Okay, I don't want to play the game, but if you ask casually, they tell them who's the president of Iraq, and they'll give you the name, who's the Swiss president, okay. So this is a good system. And the second one, so how is it organized? It's organized bottom up in the sense that the problem of bureaucrats is, they're nice people, bureaucrats, but they're not harmed by their mistake because it's a spreadsheet that doesn't look at you, whereas if you live in a community, you're a lot more careful with expenditures because people run into you someday at church coming out, and they look at you and they make you feel guilty. So there is this layer of, and then we know very well now, we've discovered, people just suddenly discovered, after thousands of years of well-managed city-states, that city-states, mayors are a lot better than presidents. You see, so bottom-up system, much more responsible. We some cities have had problems, others don't. So diversified system that's bottom-up, and this is Switzerland. This is how it works. And this is the reason money's coming here. One day I was arguing, I was in Paris, and it was a fancy lunch. And of course, each one had to make a remark. And it was Europe, we're not integrated enough. No, it's not enough. They wanted more Europe. And then I was sitting there, I said, you're smack in the middle of Europe, all right? Your neighbor, smack in the middle of Europe, Switzerland, all right, has exactly the opposite attributes that he's trying to have. And the reaction was, yeah, because they get all this money going there. Okay, why do they get all this money going there? Because they're stable. Because people want to put their money there. Because money is safer in Switzerland. Okay.
And they're a little bit secretive as well.
Reason. So maybe it's a positive feedback loop. Maybe you guys got too rich here. But the idea of Switzerland, okay, as a model, never crossed the minds of the people in Brussels. Plus, on paper, they have the subsidiarity principle, okay, embedded in their laws, but yet they don't realize what that principle was behind, right? Plus, there's another thing that worries me with governments, is that if you look at France today, share of government to GDP, with the internet, governments are becoming bigger, not smaller. We have had, over the past 200 years, a rise of the role of government, you see? So if you're going to have more government, make it as local as you can to be manageable.
Well, but if the president in the US was as powerful as you suggest here, Obama currently wouldn't have all those discussions about the debt ceiling. If he could so easily change it.
No, right? The point is not whether he's powerful. He's not powerful enough to do something right, and way too powerful to make a huge mistake, as George W. That's the problem, all right. Okay.
There was another question, I think, somewhere. Maybe it got answered.
Most of our fiscal problems in the United States come from the Iraq War.
Come from?
The Iraq War.
The Iraq War.
Yeah, it consumed something like, people say, up to 30% of GDP for Iraq. And so can you imagine another adventure somewhere else? You know what it would cost?
Ms. Briand, let's take you in, bring you in. We want to talk about opportunities for investors. Do you generally think that investors' behavior has changed because of all the events in recent years? Do you witness major changes?
I wish I'd say yes, but I don't think that there has been a dramatic change in the way people structure their portfolio. I think there's been a lot of discussion after the crisis about tail events and so on. But in practice, when we discuss with institutional investors, we don't see a radical change in the way they structure portfolios. What's interesting is if you look at many of the industries, they're very often mechanism to prepare for crisis. It's sometimes called business continuity planning. So people train for earthquake. People know what to do when their portfolios when events can happen. And when you look at the institutional world, there is no such notion of really BCP. So planning for event that you cannot forecast, but where you know that you will have a crisis and you sort of train for a number of elements that you can do when those crises come. So unfortunately, I think we've had a series of crises, and as time passes, the sort of memory is short in markets. So I'm not sure that structurally there's been any major change, and as a consequence, sort of some of the true and tested approaches of trying to diversify broadly, are probably the elements that should remain, because for the rest, forecasting is difficult, and it leads to concentration, and concentration leads to more risk.
But with all the uncertainties in developed countries, has investors' appetite for developing countries and emerging and frontier markets, which we will be talking about later on, increased?
Yeah, I mean, generally people are definitely seeing developed markets as problematic countries, and as a consequence, they look at the emerging one as a safer haven. But here again, even if indeed in many aspects the emerging market countries are structurally better on some aspects than developed one, they haven't had a major crisis for a while, and those are still countries growing at high rate with infrastructure politically and market-wise that are less robust than developed markets. So there will be also on those in those countries some hiccups. What's striking, and where maybe I have a different view than on the US than Dr. Taleb is when you compare emerging market systems, so both politically and in looking at central banks and how the economic system works, and you compare that with the US in particular, there is still quite a huge gap in terms of the overall quality, and quality is not the quality of any individual institution, but the sort of behavior as a group, and as a consequence, I think the US in particular has been quite resilient, through time due to the quality of the institutions, right?
The US is resilient because they can borrow $1.3 trillion a year, 1.3 trillion a year, okay, 1.3 trillion, and find people, to buy their bonds, including, fools like me. I buy short-term treasury bonds, you see, because I got nowhere else to go immediately. So because they've had that if they switch, if no longer the dollar stops, there's a reserve currency somewhere that emerges other than gold, because gold scares people. Then goodbye. They can't raise 1.3 trillion a year, because American citizens won't buy treasury bonds if they could find another alternative currency. The thing I talk about when I meet people who are looking for investments is, I need a reserve currency that's not gold and not the dollar, and they can't find it. You see, the minute we find a currency like that, it's gone. You see. The thing would fall apart. We've got to raise $1.3 trillion a year. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, but it sort of raised the question of the economic leadership, right? The reason why the U.S. dollar is seen as a reference currency is because of the economic dominance, and there is a shift here.
It was past dominance. It was. The euro didn't take over, and they're lucky they didn't take over. So that way they can't borrow the euro. Just help them not to borrow. The euro didn't take over, but the U.S. is using past history, as a dominance. Yeah. The point is, when you have to borrow $1.3 trillion a year, you're very fragile.
Of course, but the other main countries, are not in a dissimilar situation. So in a sense,
there are a lot of countries that are in a great situation. I mean, you go to Chile. The Chileans have come to New York to be yelled at, and now the Treasury, they go down. They need the Chileans, they need the Brazilians. They go and they get yelled at now. You see, it doesn't take a long time for countries to catch up.
So, do you invest in those countries as well?
I try to invest in as far away. I mean, I can diversify myself. I go to these countries because I feel comfortable. They don't have a lot of debt, and they hate debt now. They went through the problem. And there are places where they can't have big banking crises. Like this place has governance and banking. Now, that's the only place where bankers were ever clawed back. Brazil. In Brazil, the president of a bank that fails is liable to his personal assets. So they really know about these tail risk and how to avoid these things. Where the United States were still, completely managed by that banking mafia around Geithner, with Obama.
There was a question in the back of the room.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Sinn, please. In your presentation, you have argued that the southern European countries need a devaluation of, depending on the country, something of about 30%. You have said that is politically impossible, and given the example of the Weimar Republic, where we had blood in the streets because of a devaluation of, I think, 23%. Yet, on the other hand, at the very beginning of your presentation, you have also said that during the Schröder years, Germany has had a devaluation of about 22%, or an increase of competitiveness of about 22, 23%. Does that not prove that this sort of devaluation or increase in competitiveness is possible without blood in the streets?
Yes, it is possible. So over 13 years, from 1995 until 2008, Germany has devalued by 22% relative to its trading partners in the Eurozone. First of all, it is a long period of time. Second, it was a stagnation, which many people don't see. Many people argue that Germany was the big winner of the euro, which is nonsense. It really suffered with mass unemployment, lowest growth rate of the European countries, lowest net investment share of all OECD countries, and so on. So it was a very painful process, but in the end it worked. So, but I also said in my presentation that if you look at France and Spain, this is 20% devaluation according to Goldman Sachs. So I would say if you give them a decade with 2% inflation below the trading partners in the Eurozone, they are there. That is possible. But take Greece and Portugal. Here we have something between 30 and 40%. That's a longer way, A. And B, who finances them in the meantime? They are cut off from the capital market, so it is much, much more difficult to do than in the case of Spain and France. And also I would qualify even that statement more by, because one difference was when Germany had to become more competitive, because the capital was going to other places, seeking higher interest, because Germany went overvalued into the Eurozone and so on. Germany had the advantage that the partners in the Eurozone were used to inflate. You know, the Italians just kept inflating even though they were in the Eurozone. That was easy for Germany to stay behind. Now, the reverse process is much more difficult because those countries that were used to inflate have to stop inflating, and Germany, which is not used to inflating, has to inflate. the resistance in Germany against such an inflationary course will be enormous. So my prediction is we simply won't accept a 4% rate of inflation for the next few years. That will undermine or overstress the political tolerance of the system in Germany. So as we don't, the difficulty for the others is to really come down with their prices. They cannot just stop inflating. They really have to come down, and that is something which is close to impossible. I showed you the graphs. I mean, you can make your own predictions of whether you think they will be there in the foreseeable period of time. Do you remember this graph where we had the actual price development and the target level, this vertical, horizontal line, and these huge gaps? So, I mean, you don't have to be an economist, but you see nothing there. You see nothing. And if we see nothing, it implies that this is simply not possible. So Greece, Portugal, I don't see a possibility, to be frank. And for Spain and France, it will be a period of a decade of stagnation. If you have a competitiveness problem, you cannot grow out of your problem. You can only shrink out of your problem in nominal terms, and hopefully it's only a price cut rather than a real shrinkage. I'm afraid the politicians in Europe have not understood that at all. If they speak about reforms, for example, yeah, they have wonderful language, the semantics is okay, we need reform, but they don't understand that reform means reducing the lower bounds on the wage distribution, as Schröder has done. So reduce the minimum wage, make the wages fall, and thereby make the prices fall. That is the only way. There are no reforms that can make a country competitive that do not cut the price level. Politicians think you can do something. There is some possibility. Let's do reforms, nice reforms that harm no one, and we will become competitive. How, please? We need the realignment in the Eurozone, and either we will have it, then the Euro will survive, or we won't have it, and it will not survive, at least not with all countries.
I'm going to have to wrap it up in a minute, but you wanted to say something?
Yeah, there is one question that comes to my mind here. After the First World War, Germany was in debt because of reparations and all that story. And J.M. Keynes came and said, well, it is not realistic to ask Germany to save that much money to pay the reparations as long as no one else was ready to spend that much money, because you cannot save something nobody has spent before. Now, if you turn things around today, the Southern European countries could say, well, we would like to save, but we need somebody who is ready to dissave, and that might be the Germans. What would you answer to that view?
Yeah, I don't think they can repay their debt. So we have to forgive the debt. There's no alternative. The question is, who pays the bill? The current creditors of these countries? Do they give up some of their claims? Or do they succeed in shifting the bill to the taxpayer so that they can escape their misinvestment? And my position is clear. It should be the investors themselves who foot the bill. The countries are over-indebted and can't repay. But even if we solve the debt problem, we have not solved the competitiveness problem. That's the hard problem. They are interrelated, of course, because the cheap credit inflated them and deprived them of their competitiveness. And in order to be able not to borrow, they have to become competitive. Taking the old debt away will keep us with the same problem for the future as long as they cut their wages and prices.
Don't you think that there's the big problem we've had in the United States, okay, that nobody wanted to harm the banks? Nobody wanted to harm the banks. It's bad actually for the banking system. It makes bank system the cushiest position you can have in the world, where whatever mistake you make, you don't pay the price. Like the fact that banks are unharmed in the United States is what has been slowing us down. Don't you have the same, why not transfer the problem to those who were the cause? Those who lent to Greece should pay the price. Why should...
Right, exactly.
But why there's so much resistance to that point?
Because
it's not the German taxpayer did not lend to the Greeks.
Well, it's clear why. If you're a creditor and your debtor won't repay, you're nervous, right? You're the capital market, you're nervous. And if you succeed in bringing the taxpayer in, you're less nervous.
I see, but this is where I see the big unfairness that has held us back, is that the taxpayer today is subsidizing, either in the United States, inflation and debasement of the currency and future liabilities for our children. We're paying for mistakes made. Some fool lend to another fool, all right? Lending to the subprime. Now, the two are not paying a penny, almost. The ones who are paying the price are the taxpayers.
Right.
Every April 15, I write a check. Some of it goes...
Exactly.
Okay, so this is where you have a moral problem. It is a moral problem, that those who made a mistake are not harmed by their mistake. But you still have the same with Greece. Why not call up the banker and say, you're on your own, all right? Because the bankers are hijacking the system by saying, well, we're going to have a crisis and we'll lose talents and whatever it is, all right? But we know that.
So I think we have to finish off here. We are running a little bit late, and I can see some hungry faces. We learned a number of things. One thing definitely that Swiss people keep quiet, not only when it comes to other people's bank accounts, also in a panel discussion, but I hope you still thought that it was an interesting discussion. I certainly thought so. We also now know that Mr. Taleb invests in the euro, and that Professor Sinn would advise a rich relative to also invest in the euro, so that should make us, I think, more optimistic on the general situation. We will hear more about developing countries, emerging markets later on, also about Switzerland, because as good as it might sound, there are also uncertainties in Switzerland, but all that after some real food. This was a lot of brain food now. We will have a lunch break, and then in about, let's say, 45 minutes time, you are hopefully back to find out where exactly you find growth these days in emerging and frontier markets. So until then, and please give a big hand to our panelists, Professor Sinn, Professor Birchler, Professor Taleb, and Mr. Briand. Thank you very much. Thank you.